Hello, everyone. Welcome to Alchemized Women. We are with Eileen Tupaz. Eileen is a Philippine-based clinical psychologist, international mindfulness meditation teacher, mentor, retreat facilitator, well-being consultant, and practitioner, and former yoga teacher and yoga teacher trainer. Since 2011, she's been supporting people in lifelong labor of growing losses from proverbial nuts, and she loves providing this support in the form of teaching, mentoring, counseling, and coaching. She's passionate about helping people feel safe enough with themselves and in the world so that they can pursue their deepest intentions and embody their highest expression, even in the face of trials and tribulations of life. Much of mindfulness teachings of Eileen is carried through the online mindfulness and meditation communities, Banyan and the Lotus Path, and I have privilege to work with Eileen in Banyan Together. Welcome, Eileen.
Namaste, friends. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this talk. The material that I'm going to present over the next couple of minutes is material that I first developed when I was asked to lead a women's retreat a couple of months back. And the request was, how do we navigate the later stages of our lives as women while also grappling with the many other changes that are happening in the wider sphere, in the collective or the global stage, so to speak. So as requests go, it was a pretty big ask. But they did tell me they found it extraordinarily helpful. So I'm hoping that what we generated during our time together will be of benefit to you as well. So I'll start with setting the scene because I find it helpful to kind of situate things on a longer time scale or to adopt a historical perspective. And so the first thing that I want to share is this idea. Well, it's not just an idea, but really over how in the last 75 years, the world has changed dramatically with technological, social, and cultural changes reinforcing each other exponentially. And I'm naming that because until this particular era in our history as a species, change wasn't that rapid. Okay, so this is relatively modern. This sense of the pace of life being breathtakingly fast. Okay, so I'm just naming that. That's something that's really just been felt in the last 7.5 decades. And what's striking is not just the scale of the change, but really how it's picking up in terms of its pace. So it's getting faster and faster. The rate of change is intensifying because of exponential innovation and intensified globalization. Every single decade since the 1950s has been marked by an ever faster spread of ideas and an ever faster adoption of technologies. And why that matters is all of this has translated into far greater disruptions to the lives of ordinary men and women. And the strain of having to constantly adapt to a changing set of circumstances at an ever fasting rate exacts an enormous toll. It's taxing on the body physically, and it's taxing on the heart mind. Okay, so taxing psychologically. So just a couple of things that I want to highlight. First, because these changes are happening so quickly, we have precious little time to reflect or to even anticipate. We don't really have a lot of time to adapt or to adjust. And we certainly don't have a lot of time to recover. And just when we think that we've survived another change, there's another wave of transformations coming our way. And so the constancy of that work of adaptation leaves many of us feeling stressed, burnt out, exhausted, and overwhelmed. Okay. Second, because the change is so pervasive, it affects so many spheres and domains of our lives, it destabilizes everything from our roles and our identities to the relationships that we have and even the careers that we pursue. Okay? And this leaves many of us feeling anxious, disoriented, fearful, and unsafe. When I think about my own life, I've had around 5 different careers And the relationships that accompany each of those stages has fluctuated dramatically. Okay? And also because the people that I form those connections with are also undergoing their own changes. And so many of us have just kind of drifted apart because of geographical disconnections. They're in different countries, or I've moved myself. And then finally, because the changes often lead to unpredictable consequences, many of these changes, we don't really know how things are going to look 5 years, 10 years down the line. So because the changes often lead to unpredictable outcomes or impacts, this makes it harder for us to lean on the past to navigate the present, meaning the lessons that we learned before, we're not very sure anymore if those are going to be applicable to what we're going to face in the future. So we might have accumulated many decades of experience, so to speak, but now the question is that experience even going to amount to much in the future that's ahead of us? Okay, so we have a harder time leaning on the past to navigate the present, and we have an even harder time preparing for the future. So the next thing I want to touch upon are just some, this is not exhaustive, but just some of the collective macro changes that we're facing, so to speak. The first is, of course, artificial intelligence. We can expect AI to be integrated into everything, everywhere, with consequences on data privacy, job automation, and financial security. Okay? We can expect climate change to accelerate even more, with impacts on geopolitical dynamics, okay, the relationships between countries, basically, global migration as climate refugees increase in number, and of course, resource security, because as the climate warms up, that will change food security, water security, and the availability of energy. And then finally, at least final for this talk, we can expect longer living populations to age even further. And that's going to have consequences on national workforces and social support systems, because as the population ages and there are fewer young people to support them, to whom do we turn to for support in these twilight years? Okay. So as I said earlier, all of these global changes intersect with the changes that happen in a woman's life. Okay. So again, this is a very brief overview. It's definitely not exhaustive, but just to name that there are 4 broad stages that we're looking at here. The first 2 decades of life, you can call that youth. The next 2 decades, adulthood. The next 2 decades, midlife. And the next decades after that, later life. And in the first 2 decades of life, these are the years when women mostly get educated. Doesn't mean that it ends by that age. Okay, there's puberty, there's menstruation, we form our identities. As we shift into adulthood, the next 2 decades, we're starting careers, we're entering marriages or partnerships, we become parents for the first time, we start defining who we are. And then the midlife stage, we advance in our careers, parenting, we get more accustomed to it. Menopause becomes the thing to deal with, and we redefine ourselves. And in the later stages of life, then it's grappling with retirement, grandparenting, getting old, reflecting on the life that we've had. Okay? Now, each of these eras has its own challenges. So the first 2 decades, issues with menstrual health, not to say that menstrual health stops being a thing after that era, okay? Grappling with body image issues, coming to terms with gender-based standards and expectations. In adulthood, then the challenges include balancing the obligations of work with commitments to family, having to grapple with pay gaps that are gendered, feeling the pressures of our respective societies around marriage and children, and having to deal with reproductive choices. And then as we shift to midlife, work-life balance continues to be a struggle. Then caregiving stress kicks in as we begin to care for aging parents, having to deal with menopause, and having to grapple with workplace or societal ageism. Okay? And then finally, in the later years of life, having to deal with longevity that might be complicated by declining health, okay, being invisible, being isolated and lonely, and being financially insecure. And these challenges are exacerbated in our era by a couple of things. So for young women today, heightened body image concerns and a higher risk of bullying due to social media exposure and use, and confusion and stress from rapidly changing gender norms. In adulthood, career paths can be destabilized due to automation. I've already mentioned AI, the fact that many of us are now participating in gig economies where there's little to no job security, overwhelm from societal or cultural expectations to have it all, okay, the family and the career, and then decision-making stress from new fertility technologies. And for those entering midlife, the sandwich generation stress from caring for children and parents simultaneously while also working. And then there's the stress from menopause stigma and gendered ageism. And then finally, in the later stages of life, the financial insecurity I mentioned earlier, which was caused by gendered pay gaps and or interrupted careers, because women can interrupt their careers to raise families. Okay, so those factors exacerbate the financial insecurity of later life. And that can also be further exacerbated by volatile economies and inadequate social safety nets. Okay, so in other words, now all those macro level challenges that I named, rapidly accelerating change, pervasive change, these intersect with the changes that happen in a woman's life in ways that heighten the precarity and the vulnerability of women. And so one thing that I recommend that you all do after listening to this talk is to take some time to map the changes that are occurring on a micro and a macro level. Okay, so map out the personal and collective changes, if you will, that are already impacting you or will impact you in the different domains of your life. Just getting it down on paper, right? And then afterwards, review your answers and identify which of these changes or their intersections are causing you the least concern and the most concern. And it's good to reflect on the changes that are least concerning for us, because then we can identify like, oh, this isn't such a concern for me because I have these kinds of resources, I have these kinds of supports, I have these kinds of skill sets. And then just reflecting on these other areas cause me the most concern because this is where I feel the least resourced or the least supported. Okay, so noticing both of those things can be very insightful and very fruitful in terms of identifying next steps. Okay, so that's something I suggest that you do afterwards. Now, I want to introduce an idea that I first learned in my 20s from reading a book by William Bridges. And he's famous for his work around the construct of transitions. And these are ideas that have been around for the last 4 to 5 decades. Okay? So the first is the notion of what change is. So change is situational. Okay? They're external situation and often quickly occurring events. And what's important to keep in mind is that change happens to people. Okay? And this is distinct from transitions. If changes are situational, transitions are psychological. Transitions are the internal, psychological, and often gradual processes that people undergo in order to adapt to change. Transitions happen within people. So, for example, a wedding is a change. Okay? Takes a day in most cultures. But the transition from single life to partnered life, That doesn't necessarily take a single day. Okay? It's gradual. There are things that transpire along that journey. And so changes happen to people, transitions happen within people. And when we talk about transitions, William Bridges refers to 3 stages. Okay? The first stage of the transition is what he refers to as endings. And this involves recognizing, honoring, grieving, and relinquishing what no longer is or what will no longer be. So I think that's a powerful idea in its own right, recognizing that any transition begins with an ending. Okay? Something is lost, something will no longer be, something is coming to a termination. And so recognizing and honoring what is ending. The next stage of the transition is what he refers to as the neutral zone. And this is the phase where there's anxiety and confusion and disorientation because the old state of affairs is irretrievably gone, but the new state of affairs has yet to consolidate or has yet to be even envisioned. Okay. And so that it's this liminal area where what we knew is no longer there, but what is yet to come hasn't solidified yet. And for many, this can be incredibly uncomfortable. And it's only at the very end that we come to the new beginning. And this phase involves finally accepting what has come to be and meeting it with some degree of serenity, vitality, or equanimity, and maybe even a sense of enthusiasm and excitement. Okay? And so the really important point that I want to make here is it isn't the changes that do you in, it's the transitions. Okay, so this is from William Bridges. Many times we focus too much on the change itself and we don't attend to the inner process of transition, adjustment that the external change is necessitating of us. Okay. And that's why William Bridges is saying that it's not the changes that do people in, it's really the transitions. And so after this talk, I invite you to take some time to map out the transitions associated with 1 to 3 changes that are causing you the most concern right now. So you can refer to the earlier activity where you identified the changes that are most concerning for you. And then you can begin to identify what are the transitions that are accompanying this particular change. And so now I just want to offer a few practical tips on navigating transitions, and this is by no means exhaustive. Okay. So the first is to honor the endings, to consciously acknowledging what's being lost. It might be a role, it might be an identity, it might be a way of life. Okay. Honoring the ending helps reduce the disorientation because we're explicitly acknowledging that something is ending. And it validates the grief that does accompany change. Even changes that we cherish still involve the loss of something. And so honoring that loss with grief makes absolute sense. Next, crafting rituals. It's a little easier to tolerate the uncertainty of the neutral zone by creating sources of stability. And rituals can give us that, journaling at the end of the day, starting the day with a meditation or a prayer, walking our dogs. These little islands of predictability can help give us some footing when the proverbial rug has been pulled out from under our feet. And the last suggestion is to find community when we're navigating both personal and collective changes and transitions, whether it's the change of menopause, whether it's having your industry turned upside down by AI. If you can find people who are grappling with the same changes, who are struggling to make the same transitions, it can be profoundly supportive. Much of my work involves holding space for groups. And what is magical is that a lot of times people just need to have their stories and their struggles heard, seen, and witnessed. It's not even about getting a solution. It's just having somebody listen to you share your heartbreak or your terror, and to see people nod and say, I know exactly what that feels like. That in itself is a tremendous source of refuge. Okay? So before we close, I just like to lead a short practice that's in line with much of what I shared. So I invite you to just sit in a way that allows you to embody both dignity and ease. You can lower your gaze or close your eyes. Just taking a little bit of time to sense if you need to make any adjustments to your posture. And then whenever you feel sufficiently stable and supported, just taking the next 3 to 5 breaths consciously. Taking a long, deep breath in. Taking a long, slow exhale out. Breathing in. Breathing out. Inhaling and exhaling. Now, I invite you to bring to mind one change that you've had to kind of transition through. Might be a change in your career, might be a change in your role in the family, might be a change like a physical relocation. Just bringing to mind one particular change. And now let's reflect on the different stages of the transition that this requires of us. So first, just taking some time to honor the endings that have accompanied this change. Just giving yourself permission to quietly name the many different things that this change signals the ending of. Might be the end of particular routines, the end of particular rhythms, the termination of particular responsibilities. Just quietly acknowledging, recognizing, and honoring what is ending with this change. Giving yourself permission to feel the sadness of that parting, the sense of loss that accompanies that ending. And if it feels appropriate, resting in a felt sense of gratitude for what was good about all that. What was it that you appreciated about what has ended? And if there's a lot that's coming up for you, you can always continue this practice after today's talk. Just taking some time to acknowledge, recognize, and honor what has ended. And shifting gears now to the neutral zone. Acknowledging what still feels uncertain. What is it that might be causing you anxiety or dread or worry? Just noticing and naming what isn't clear yet. What hasn't solidified yet. where you're still treading water, so to speak. And again, giving yourself permission to feel this discomfort, to feel this disorientation. You're not doing anything wrong. You're not falling short. The neutral zone is difficult for most human beings, if not all human beings. And finally, shifting your attention to the new beginning. And you might not even know what this looks like yet. And that's okay. Perhaps there is a vision that inspires you and you can bring that to mind. Or perhaps you can simply rest in the sense of excitement and possibility, the kind that you felt in beginnings you've experienced in the past. Just allowing yourself to connect with that sense of openness and possibility, even if you don't know what shape it will take. Finally, take a long, deep breath in. Take a long, slow exhale out. Take a few moments to notice what came up for you from doing that short practice. Holding on lightly to whatever you found insightful, useful, and valuable, and then setting aside whatever did not serve. And whenever you're ready, you can bring essences back to our shared space. And to conclude, I just want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to this. I hope that some of it was of benefit. And if you have questions or concerns that came up for you, just feel free to reach out. Thank you once again. And I wish you as much ease and grace as is possible in whatever changes and transitions life is sending your way right now. Namaste.